Zach and I often do two podcasts in tandem when we record these. One is for the Life Process program, and one is for what we call PeelTube, which is for my personal podcast channel. And the LPP one we were discussing was sort of, for want of a better word, making do with life, accepting where you are in life, appreciating it, and that often gives you the best chance to progress beyond that. And so, that ties into a little bit to what I'm going to talk about today, which is, my career and theoretical inputs into the addiction field. And I'm going to present a kind of a new way of thinking about things now. But before I did that, I was going to speak a little bit in my memoir, A Scientific Life on the Edge. I talk about times in my life when I've been pretty well disregarded and times when I've had more input. And I talked about the possibility that I'd reach another stage where, I'm not getting the kind of exposure or acceptance that I'd like to. And I'd say that right about now is one of those cases. I've been removed from an awful lot of my major outlets. I no longer write regularly for Will Godfrey's The Influence when I've been writing for his previous publications, Substance.com and on The Influence. His current one is Filter. I'm no longer writing. I used to write regularly for Reason and for Psychology Today. Ethan Nadelman has a podcast. Ethan and I go back more than a quarter century. He doesn't look like he's going to have me on my podcast. And so I'm in a place where my outlets are curtailed. So let me just throw that back to you for a second, Zach. You know me a little bit. How do you think I react to that kind of lack of broad scale recognition and acceptance for my current phase in my ideas?
I think you react to it in two different ways that include one big way. I think that there is the conceptual aspect. Well, the world would benefit from some common sense and my level of thinking. So it's an enormous shame that at least if I'm not being able to broadcast what I know to be true about addiction and psychology and well-being, and no one else seems to be either. So is this a disservice for the world? And is it a disservice for, is it looking like we're all using the same mouthpiece now to talk about these concepts? So there's that way of thinking. And then there's the natural human resentment aspect that I'm sure that you have that says, well, Jesus, I came up with these things that people are talking about, and they're doing kind of a bastardized version of my thinking. And where's my credit? Because I ought to have credit for some of these things.
That's a pretty good summary, Zach. Both of those are present in my thinking. And I just want to augment the first part by saying I'm slightly bemused. Nobody feels that we're doing well in the United States in terms of mental health and drug and alcohol use, addiction, and death. And, I make the joke that Akasha Malinowska, who runs the drug part of the Soros Foundation, says, well, drug deaths have multiplied incredibly during the time that I've been head of this. But I do want to report one piece of progress. I've never had Stanton Peele talk in front of Open Society Foundation. So I have I don't know if it's cynical, a slightly bemused aspect. Things are going so badly in such a reverse direction, and yet people feel so free to be unwilling to or unable to open themselves to my way of thinking. I want to throw another question. That you were so good on that. Let me throw another question back at you. I had the strangest experience. I've been writing for Will Godfrey's various publications, if I can remember them all, substance.com, The Influence and Filter. He scores of pieces. I'm a little bit shut out from that now. And I sometimes think, damn, I'm dragging Zach down too. And you had a little discussion, I think, with Will. Did you get some feeling for why our point of view is point of view non grata at this point in time?
I'm going to limit what I say about
Please
because
do.
in our discussion, one of the things he said is, okay, before he disclosed anything, this is between you and me, right? And I said, yes. So I honor those things. The sense that I got was some days, a lot of days, he hates being an editor. He likes the fact that there's a way that he can provide his value to people, to readers, to the masses. And he hates the fact that he's a funnel for people's concerns, no matter what they are. It's almost like a political spot that he's in. So it has to do with that.
So I'm going to use this as a way of branching into one of the topics that we're going to discuss today. The broader topic I want to discuss is a whole new way of thinking about both addiction and misuse of substances on the one hand, and on the other hand, abstinence from those substances and the whole recovery movement. And I want to bring them both together, and I want to build off Carl Hart. And one of the things we're going to talk about in that regard is how alcohol fits into that picture. So I just want to tell one little story. I hope it's not out of school, in the sense that I was just sitting minding my own business when I got an email from somebody who is mutually known to both me and Will. And Will has been, over the years, extremely concerned and good about publishing my information that alcohol has very many beneficial effects. By the way, a new study has just come out. I just want to throw it out there. It was done in Korea. It involved an incredible number of people, millions of people. And they did something in Korea that we're not allowed to do in America. They got some people to start drinking who weren't drinking. And then they got some people who were drinking too much to cut back their drinking. And in both instances, they improved their cognitive functioning and reduced their level of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. You would never be allowed to do that kind of a study in America. Say to people, why don't you consider maybe drinking some alcohol? That you couldn't do that here. And you can't in America. This was published. This study appeared in JAMA online, JAMA Network Open. So it was reported on Medline and other places. In America, we're just going to ignore them. So that's just one little factotum out there. I got this strange email from a person involved in the drug policy area saying, look, there's an increase in drinking problems among young people in Colorado. And this isn't a person I normally correspond with. And I said, okay, you're writing me this. Why? What do you think we should do about that? Tell people, well, in Colorado, they have legal marijuana, cut out alcohol altogether and just smoke marijuana? Or you think, well, we should raise the drinking age in Colorado? America, drinking age is 21, which is higher than anywhere in Europe. And it used to be that in Spain and France and Italy, the drinking age was 16. And actually, the drinking age was nothing because they don't really observe it. Why are you inputting this to me at this point? And to me, it's part of, and especially I thought, well, this person knows Will, and Will is very concerned very often to allow me to express the information that alcohol prolongs longevity and increases cognitive functioning, drunk in appropriate amounts. how is this happening with a person who's intermediate between the two of us? And so I imagine that one of the pressures that Will deals with in dealing with me is that there is a counter movement. There's a strong trend of anti-alcohol use in the drug policy reform movement. And so I want to move on to discussing a new way of thinking about addiction, positive and negative uses of substance, changing our relationship, changing the interface between human beings and substance use. And I want to base it on Carl Hart's work. I mean, Carl Hart's basically talking about the normalization of drug use. And his fundamental platform is, well, most drug use is not harmful, no matter what the drug is. And in fact, in many or most cases, it's beneficial. He talks about his own experience about using heroin in preparation for a tension-producing or a boring meeting. And in a way, that's kind of harm reduction, which is saying, well, people use substances for some motivation to get through life. And he's trying to maybe branch out to saying, well, in many ways, these are sort of positive. And so that's a whole new way of thinking, to my mind, about the relationship that human beings have with substances. If it's normal to take substances, then we can say equally that addiction, taking too much of a substance or being too compulsively involved in a substance, and on the other hand, avoidance or abstinence are equally characteristic of an alienation from people's relationship to substances. And in doing that, Carl's brilliant. And not only is he brilliant, but he's brave. You know, he's a professor at Columbia, to go out and start telling people, well, all drug use has its potential benefits, including heroin. That's not going to, generally speaking, enhance his positive reaction for Columbia alumni. What the other thing they're going to do, they can't fire him, but still, it's really gutsy. But I wanted to point out what I feel are some of the limits of his approach and what he fails to do. I talked about this when he was interviewed by Kasia Malinowska, and she kind of reflected negatively, kind of really put him on the defensive. And I reflected, thinking about it, well, Kasia Malinowska, I don't know her personally, but I would guess that she drinks wine. I just had that feeling. She polls are relatively liberal about alcohol consumption. And in particular, Carl talks about, when he talks about alcohol, he says, well, alcohol has the same range of reactions that heroin has. So, you know, most people don't run into problems, and some people do. Why do we have separate categories for alcohol compared to those with illicit drugs, cocaine, methadone, methamphetamines, and heroin? And I certainly, in Kasia's interview with him, and in Carl's work itself, I don't think they expand enough on the positivity of alcohol. People in general, you know, I wrote a piece with Archie, you know, about the potential benefits of moderate drinking, psychological benefits. And the number one benefit is when they do general surveys of people and they ask them why they drink, their answers are so simple. They say, well, I enjoy it, or it enhances social interactions. And alcohol is an experience that most people in our framework have experienced. We've had a long history of it. And so society has had a chance to develop positive outreach around it. And my way of thinking is we could build from that. We can pay attention to what it is about how we use alcohol to expand it to areas that people are less familiar with. I mean, not many people like Carl have PhDs and are taking heroin. And we're extremely uneasy even about taking painkillers when people used to take painkillers. We're cutting back in prescriptions for painkillers. And so,
so policy reform people, including Carl Hart. Carl is maybe at a different level in some ways, but the policy reform people, harm reductionists, are saying oftentimes, drugs aren't so bad. Why do you keep saying that they're bad? They don't have to be all bad. And look at alcohol. There's two ways of saying look at alcohol. It's look at alcohol. People seem to be okay drinking it. You don't want to get trashed, but you have a couple drinks and it's okay. And the other way of saying look at alcohol is, well, why are you? It's a tu quoque. Why are you saying these things about drugs? Look how horrible alcohol is. And you are noticing this shadow of alcohol avoidance. Humanity against alcohol reaching over all of it. And you're saying, well, someone like Carl, look, if someone's going to save us, Carl, wouldn't you be the guy? Or, to say, you're trying to say there are benefits to drugs. And you're saying to Carl, something like, can you look this direction for a minute? Because rather than simply saying, alcohol is there, people seem to do okay with it. Couldn't you be saying, these are specific benefits that alcohol has, just like these are specific benefits heroin could have in a person's life? And if you could connect those dots, it could start shooing away this cloud that you're seeing.
Yeah, exactly. Well put. They actually have something in the UK coming out of the University of Sussex where periodically they do mass mailings to just a vast array of people in a panel they have. And one of their mass mailings, it's decades ago, I don't think you could do it today, is what do you enjoy about alcohol? And I'm just sitting there reading through these, and one guy says, on a summer night, I go biking with my male friends. It's a man. After we come back, we sit on my patio and we drink beer. It's just an ecstatic experience. And then a woman writes, I and my husband sit out in the evening when it's nice. We drink wine and we read books. And then one woman, I hate to make this X-rated, says, I sometimes have wines that are so good that I experience an orgasm drinking them. And I'm saying, boy, you don't see this. You're not going to get this framework in America, but I know people like that.
Right. So in America, we might say, press or whoever writes these articles that you're talking about might say something like, don't be so irresponsible as to say these nice things about alcohol and your experience with it.
When I recently visited with my old friend Alta Ann, she was living near the end of her life with her stepdaughter and her husband, and he brought out a really nice wine that he had with dinner. He's not a drug guy. And then I sort of said, oh, do you think I could have a glass? He said, well, I only had a little bit left, but he brought out a really nice beer. And I thought, this will work for me. And here, we were the height of, we're all pretty much senior citizens, extremely responsible, just really enjoying these aspects of alcohol in a social situation. And so in the United States today, I subscribe to Medium, I get a constant barrage of people who are now in recovery and experience sobriety at the ages of 50 often and 60. Brad Pitt, John Stamos, just this whole array of people who are boasting about, not boasting, investing their lives being sober, where many of them have used substances throughout their lives. And I'm wondering what's happening at the age of 50 or 60 that they've concluded that that has to be completely extirpated from their existences.
Hmm.
And alcohol is, the thing about alcohol that I particularly like is that it has a long history. I mean, everything has a long history, but alcohol has been found in every social, in every setting where human beings have gathered. They've located 5 or 6 centers of civilization in Asia and Africa and Europe. Alcohol is present in every one of those. And so we've known about alcohol forever. People talk about the fact that E2, the ethanol alcohol molecule, is sort of bred into human beings. And of course, it was hard to be an alcoholic if you were living as a subsistence farmer or a hunter. You're going to die. There's some natural acclimation that people make towards alcohol. And some societies in particular are famous for that, the Hellenic society, the Greek society, and Jewish society, where alcohol has always been extremely well integrated into the lifestyle of people. And as a result, the Old Testament and Plato's dialogues are both very virtue-oriented. Neither of them makes a virtue out of abstaining from alcohol. Mm-hmm. It's not like, and Plato has a dialogue saying, well, you should never drink. That's not a Plato's dialogue. And there's no section of the Old Testament that says, abhor alcohol. In fact, Judaism is worshipful through alcohol. And so it's not Carl's inclination to be historically oriented that way. He doesn't tend to trace things through cultural patterns in history. But of course, you can do the same things with marijuana, cocaine, and opiates. That in all of these, the settings in which they appear naturally, coca in South America, poppies have grown throughout the world, but in Afghanistan and Southeast Asia, obviously cannabis is present throughout society. In those societies where these substances are found naturally, there are not recovery movements. There wasn't in Afghanistan, there wasn't in Bolivia or Colombia movements to say, well, we've got to get rid of the coca plant. In Afghanistan, they didn't say, well, we've got to eliminate poppies. And in Southeast Asia, even when they produced heroin, it was only when Westerners came there and when Americans spread their notion of addiction, which only evolved relatively recently, only around the turn of the last century, did we take drugs and put them in a separate category of human experience and call them a disease-producing addiction. In the 19th century, people took opioids throughout society, and I almost hate to, they gave them to children. When children were teething or had trouble sleeping, they'd put it in a tincturated form and they'd give opiates to children. I mean, they'd shoot you now if you did that sort of thing. We had a natural relationship to substances where they were a part of the experience of life, including intoxication. And there's one last aspect of that. I mean, I like to think about presidential drinking. When Joe Biden ran against Donald Trump, for the first time in American history, not only did we have one presidential candidate who had never consumed alcohol, that had never happened before in American history. We had 2. Now, I'm going to cycle back to George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. George Washington was probably intoxicated every day of his life from the ages of like 20 to 45. Abraham Lincoln, not so much. But Abraham Lincoln was not a temperance person. He didn't think that alcohol should be banned. That just wasn't his taste. And what had happened between Washington and Lincoln was the Industrial Revolution. When you ran a farm that didn't have mechanized equipment, you could be a little tipsy. After the Industrial Revolution, that whole thing changed. There was working machines and driving cars. Not that Abraham Lincoln drove a car, operated a lathe, but we switched from a whole different conception around modern civilization, which became completely prevalent in the 20th century. And we lost a natural relationship to substance use. And so where I want to extend Carl Hart's thinking, normalization of substance use has as a policy implication that being too extreme, I mean, if you were addicted to alcohol and you spent all day drinking, you couldn't run your farm, you die. But on the other hand, it was a natural reaction to take advantage of alcoholic beverages, to have a mildly hazed approach to living your life and doing your work. And in that, Carl's normalization of substance use indicates a return as best as possible to having a natural relationship with substances, both alcohol and opioids, cocaine, and newly developed drugs, which we're doing somewhat. We are making a return to hallucinogenic drugs. I just want to throw out one more esoteric historical reference. A couple of decades ago, a man wrote a book called The Bicameral Brain. And the book was in two parts. In the first part, he says, how come people don't have visions anymore and talk directly to God? You know, if you read the Bible and Jesus, they were constantly in interaction with God. That doesn't happen anymore. When it does happen, we call you schizophrenic.
Right.
And his answer to that was that there used to be a bifurcation between the hemispheres of the brain, where one part of the brain talked to the other part of the brain. And in modern society, that bifurcation has failed. And when the brain's unified, and when there is a bifurcation, then you're schizophrenic. The first part of the book is fabulous. It's fantastic. It's like regular people, famous historic people, had conversations with God and with ancient spirits, and that was, everybody was good about that. Nobody thought that was strange. And now, if that happens, they put you in a mental institution. And the second part of the book was psychotic brain theory, where somehow he figures the human brain in a couple of centuries or eons has completely changed the way it's organized. Of course, he was an anthropologist. He has no idea about the way the brain works. And I think a better explanation is that people were just used to psychedelic experiences in those times. And now, one example of how we're becoming better integrated is sort of everybody's opening up to psychedelic experiences now. They're using it in therapy. They're writing bestsellers. Housewives are mini dosing. It's almost like people have rediscovered the advantages and natural positive aspects of the psychedelic experience. Other than that, we're trying to have more natural reactions to substances, but we're deeply ambivalent, to say the least. And you and I have done pieces on, well, we know that administering drugs at safe consumption sites reduces people dying. How come we can't do more of that? And in the United States, they've just opened a couple places in New York, but in your state, with a liberal Republican governor, and in California, with the most progressive governor in the country, the governors have both rejected indications by their legislatures that they should try safe consumption sites.
Yep.
So the opposition, the fight to have some kind of more natural, less antagonistic relationship with substances is being on a seesaw, back and forth. And it's not only conservatives who object to things like legalization of drugs and decriminalization on the one hand, along with safe consumption sites. It's people on all parts of the political spectrum. And that suggests that we're never going to resolve those two things. But the Carl Hart normalization of substance use across the entire range of substances, he's very clear about that. We're not just going to talk about psychedelics, which tends to somewhat be an elite kind of drug use. He wants to apply that equally to opioids, to methamphetamines, to cocaine. That's going to require a whole new mindset and relationship. And what I'm extending that to saying is equally negative and alienated from that kind of a normalization is both the recovery movement and abstinence and the addiction movement and glorifying intoxication. That, of course, that doesn't mean that we should belittle people either who are addicted or who are in recovery or decide that it's best for them to abstain. It's a free choice. What it does argue is that we should stop glorifying recovery as in the recovery nation that America has become. It certainly is against glorifying abstinence as the only resolution to substance use kinds of problems. That we need a whole new framework, both for drug policy and alcohol policy, and for individual therapy for people with problems, where the two alternatives are not extreme addiction or complete abstinence. We need to, both of which represent an alienation from what is a fundamental human experience of various kinds of substance use and even intoxication that has been a part of human experience throughout our entire history and dynasty of living and destiny. Substance use is an integral part of being a living human being.
First of all, I just feel like I got for free, like a wholesale, a college level, grad school level talk that was packed full of information and put really well. A connection that I'm making is you talked about bicameral mind. God, who is the guy that I was trying to look it up and my phone's not working. It starts with a J. I know the book, but the point being that sometime in history it may have just been it's nothingness or it's part of life to have a psychedelic experience, maybe. And the psychedelic experiences caused like an existential spiritual kind of conversation within, but which also felt like you're talking to God. And now come the turn of the last century and into this century, we're saying almost ironically, and it's funny that we're saying, hey, I have an idea. It looks like these psychedelic drugs could do something. And so what we've gone on a roundabout way of alienating a substance because of the way culture is moving, and then reintroducing a substance with some like bumpers on it, some parameters on it, and experimenting with it. So we could say, yay, we're reintroducing something that could be beneficial. You're saying, do we have to go the route of completely alienating every substance before reintroducing it and repackaging it to society? Couldn't we just lean on its benefits and our natural relationship with it that we've had over time? And I think that's a totally valuable point.
And it's a whole new way of thinking about drug and alcohol policy, where alcohol policy is, I often point out, is totally negative now. you're sort of now in American public health not allowed to say anything positive about alcohol, even though most people enjoy the alcohol experience. And in fact, the more privileged people are, the more likely they are. If I go to a restaurant in New York, people at every table are drinking wine and cocktails. That's what well-off people do in New York. And I used to go with Alta Ann to Middle Eastern restaurants because she had a Greek thing. And I would talk to the waitress and I say, are those people, they seem to be speaking Arabic. Aren't you supposed to abstain from alcohol, if you're Islamic? And she said, well, they make an exception when they're in New York. You know what I mean?
Right.
You're coming to these good restaurants, you're going to enjoy the fine things in life. It's almost like the culture has a switch they turn on and turn off. You know what I mean? They don't have bars in Saudi Arabia. They have bars in New York. And the only people from Saudi Arabia who end up in New York are big business people or international UN people.
Right.
So they change the rules. And so what I'm trying to do, it's great. I wouldn't say that Carl Hart's revelation of the normalization of drug use has been greeted with widespread acceptance. But I'd say it points to a whole new conceptualization of the range of drug and alcohol experiences that we should reorganize our thinking about in terms of drug policy and alcohol policy, which I'll end up by saying, I'm the only person in America who's against the recovery movement. When people announce that they're sober, I sort of make a mental note to no longer pay attention to them. You know what I mean? I say they're just living in a different universe. I don't have intimate relationships with people who are sober. Alta Ann was over 90. She had stopped drinking alcohol. C'est la vie, you know what I mean? But when she had lived in Greece, she drank a half a liter of wine. She's a slight woman, 110 pounds. She drank a half a liter of white wine at lunch and a half a liter of white wine at dinner. In the United States, they'd send you to the Betty Ford Center if you weigh 110 pounds and you're having a liter of wine a day. But I don't have relationships with people who alienate themselves from drug and alcohol experiences. It's a fundamental outlook I have about life. And I don't think American society and certainly American public health should be in the business of further alienating ourselves from drug and alcohol and even intoxication experiences.
Well, why not? No, kidding. That's put so well. So you don't hold out for, and you never have, and you've learned that you can't hold out for some other smart 27-year-old Stanton Peele to come up and be able to explain all the things the way that you think that they ought to be explained, or start movements the way you ought to start movements.
Well, I'm counting on you a little bit, Zach, but I would say, I'm very much present. I donate a little bit of money to Wikipedia. I'm kind of in a lot of Wikipedia. They have my name there. They have the life process model of addiction. They have discussions of the disease model of alcoholism and George Valiant, where they very much present my point of view. They have debates about the brain model of addiction, and I'm very present in that. So it's hard to say that I'm ignored or that I haven't had an impact, but it's almost like they bicycled beyond me now. They've styled beyond me, where it's hard for me to make further inputs into how we view and where we're going with drugs and alcohol, even at a time when many of my ideas have been totally mainstreamed. Harm reduction is an idea of mine. Non-12-step approaches to addiction, looking at life process and components in your life that enable you support your psychological self better so that you'll be less likely to be addicted. At the same time, the people are almost saying, okay, we've had enough of you. And I'm not ready to quit yet. I think I'm still generating along the lines that we've just been discussing, ideas that are as critical to advancing our thinking about addiction and drug use and alcohol and drinking as ever, and they're needed as much as ever.
Amen. And so one way or another, you're getting yourself out there too. And whether this is a video like this is a message in a bottle that we hope someone finds, or whether it can get widespread, you're still generating ideas and putting it out there. You have never held back, and I appreciate you, and I appreciate your ideas.
And Jack, I so appreciate your being a part of my channel and allowing me to do this. I doff my cap to you.